As we all know, climate change is currently the world's largest issue, posing a massive threat to everyone's future, especially us as the younger generation. However, something rarely considered is the way in which particular countries and communities are affected by climate change to a greater degree than other areas. This is called climate injustice.
With a lack of attention on this, many Australians do not consider these disproportionate impacts.
Therefore, we take it upon ourselves to demand justice for the millions facing the mass devastations of climate change. As the younger generation, we are humanity's last hope to alert and pressure society to put an end to this crisis. However, climate change is as much a psychological problem as it is a social problem. There are many psychological barriers that prevent us from effectively addressing and responding to climate change. As young adults struggling with the various challenges of everyday life, we tend to see climate change as a distant phenomenon, not truly threatening our lives and therefore not requiring immediate action. This is far from the truth. We must overcome these barriers of inaction and come to terms with the reality of climate change.
By now, we are all aware of climate change and the vast destruction that the large amounts of greenhouse gases being emitted into the environment is bringing. Climate change is not only resulting in temperatures increasing, but is also changing weather patterns and influencing the increased frequency and intensity of natural disasters. However, as mentioned previously, something rarely considered in the climate crisis is its disproportionate impact on marginalized communities and disadvantaged countries across the world. You may be thinking, climate change is an issue that impacts all of the world. How would it be any worse for these people? Well, these areas often have underdeveloped infrastructure and are financially undersupported by their government. These groups include Inuit, the people living in Haiti, the people below the poverty line living in Hong Kong and the Philippines, along with a countless number of others. The people within these communities need our help to alleviate these impacts and save them from the devastations of climate change. Let's take a look at the life of someone in the Philippines. Annually, the Philippines experiences at least 20 typhoons, of which usually 5 are highly destructive. The people are forced to live cautiously, always being prepared for these disasters to occur. Even children as young as 5 are forced to be prepared, having it be mandatory that all education facilities have a planned response in the event of a typhoon occurring. They cannot continue to live in this way. Whilst the reason behind these typhoons occurring in the Philippines is due to its geographical location, the extent of damage caused by them are a result of the country's lack of money and resources to support their people and rebuilding. Based on their research, climate scientists estimate that as climate change worsens, the severity of these typhoons, along with other natural disasters, will also, putting people in more severe danger.
These people also face other life-threatening issues other than the increase in natural disasters. 3 out of 4 people living in poverty rely on agriculture and natural resources for their survival. The changing weather patterns due to global warming will negatively impact the growth of crops and will therefore directly harm these people's livelihood. Climate change is also predicted to push 100 million people across the world into poverty between 2015 and 2030. From the marginalized communities suffering from natural disasters and food shortages, to the corrupt businesses capitalizing on the hunger for resources, climate change is undoubtedly worsening global conflict and insecurity. And as part of future generations, we are tasked with confronting the gravest threat to world peace. After every natural disaster, there are not only physical damages that occur, but also long-term psychological ones, particularly in disadvantaged countries. Following the 2017 September earthquake in Mexico, studies found that 36.4% of the population were experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. This was largely experienced amongst those with home damage and indigenous people, both of which are part of disadvantaged countries and marginalized communities who lack financial support during these traumatic events. Other common psychological reactions following natural disasters include substance abuse, insomnia, phobias, depression, and amnesia. Let's compare this to what happened recently in Melbourne. You wouldn't be the only one who woke up on the 22nd of September to a series of social media posts. However, it is important to think, what if your house wasn't so sturdily built? What if the earthquake was stronger? What if you were near an unsteady building? Whilst we have the luxury of making a joke about the occurrence of a mild earthquake, these are the situations that people in disadvantaged countries and marginalized communities are forced to be put in. These differences in response to natural disasters can be observed in other types of natural disasters other than earthquakes, including those which are worsening in intensity and increasing in frequency due to climate change. These are some of the issues that, due to Australia's stability, many people within the country will not have to experience. A large part of this social justice issue is how these marginalized communities contribute minimally to climate change, whilst larger and wealthier countries like Australia do not. In 2019, the Philippines released 150.6 million metric tons, whilst Australia released 526.1 million. This is why it is greatly important that we take action to help these disadvantaged countries. Australia was recently ranked last out of 193 countries in the United Nations Sustainable Development Report, which measured the country's progress in achieving sustainable development goals. If you are wondering why this matters to us, this is because we are part of a country which is a large contributor to this global devastation. As global citizens, we need to fulfill our duty in decreasing the impacts of climate change on these marginalized communities.
The reason why many people in Australia and other developed countries struggle to take action against the climate crisis is largely psychological. The reason behind our lack of action is due to our experience-based cognitive bias. An experience bias is the state where someone's tendencies and behaviors are influenced by their past experiences, where they assume that many people share that experience. When Australia experiences natural disasters and other climate change related issues, our wealth and resources allow for the damage to be contained significantly in comparison to disadvantaged countries. After Australians survive these events, we often possess an experience bias as we focus on our own survival and believe that people in these marginalized communities and disadvantaged countries experience the same devastations. However, this bias impairs our way of perceiving climate change, as in actuality, the people in these countries and communities experience significantly harsher impacts of climate change. This can be observed in Melbourne's recent earthquake, where people were talking about surviving a major event and comparing it to more significant disasters, despite it having minimal impacts on the majority of people who are saying it. We, as the younger generation, are the most capable of overcoming this cognitive bias through our presence on social media. By expanding our perceptions of the world and understanding other people's experiences that are shared through social media, we are able to truly comprehend the devastations that climate change is having across the world. However, social media is also a platform where our biases can grow. Especially among the older generation, misinformation and lack of climate education has prompted climate change skeptics who question its existence and severity. These misconceptions are fueled by pseudoscientific studies spread through social media. As the younger generation, we must use our voices to overcome this spread of misinformation and overcome our cognitive biases to realize that climate change is not an issue of the future, it is an unaddressed issue of the present. In 2019, a study credited by the Australian Psychological Society estimated that 95% of Australian youth believe that climate change is a serious problem, whilst a different study from the Lowy Institute estimated that 64% of Australian adults believe that climate change is a critical threat. From these studies, it is clear that we have the responsibility of making more older Australians, the people who have the power to introduce changes, understand the climate crisis better.
Results from an Australian research study conducted in 2015 indicate that individuals expressing stronger global than national attachments were more likely to take action against the climate crisis. As our generation was raised in the age of the internet, we have the advantage of social media. Though sometimes we take it for granted, the internet grants us the ability to connect with people all over the world. This inevitably strengthens our global attachment. It explains why when we see the climate injustice around the world, when we see innocent lives lost, when we see people losing their homes, when we see the poor hungry, we, as part of the younger generation, feel obliged to take the necessary action to revive the global peace. This puts us in a very critical position to prompt change. On the flip side, we are able to use social media as a means of advocating for action on climate change to people our age. We are constantly scrolling through TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram trying to distract ourselves from reality. But we must face the reality of climate injustice. If we can get everyone talking about celebrity gossip or get everyone doing the latest TikTok dances, think about how we can truly make a change if we get everyone talking about issues concerning the very lives of others. If there are people around the world suffering from our inactions, this is a more than enough reason to be concerned. We need to talk about it and promote the norm that acting on climate change is a necessity and not a choice. There are many ways in which we are able to take action against this social injustice, which include voting, signing petitions, spreading awareness, attending protests, and many more. Even if you are not of age to be voting, having these conversations and putting attention on these issues can persuade eligible adults to vote with consideration of them. If many of us can come together in small ways and prompt changes in the way we live, and change government environmental policies, we are able to help these people and end climate injustice.